Hey everyone, this is week 2 of the Doctrine of God. If you're just joining us, I sent you an email for last week. Make sure you look over the syllabus. All of the content is in there. If you're joining us for week 2, welcome. I enjoyed reading all of your responses. Again, there will be an assignment for this week. It is due on Saturday. Please get that to me so I can grade it before the beginning of this week. And yeah, let me know. You can always email me if you have any questions. Okay, so this week we are talking about knowledge, reason, and epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word for how do we know what we know. And so we're going to kind of create a basis from last week to this week before we start talking about proofs for God's existence in this class. Just as a reminder, theology, every person has a theology. Theology is part of all of our lives, and one of the things I'm not sure I mentioned last time, but even atheism as being a theology, atheism is actually what we will get to later as a proof for God's existence, because there's no reason atheism itself would exist without the existence of God. Again, theology is a combination of our reason, our experience, our observations, culture, world culture, history, and our ethics. And again, the review of Kant, Descartes, Hume, Hobbes, all of the Enlightenment thinkers and the liberal theology began to see that there is no objective reality, there is no objective truth, everything is subjective. And I argued last week that there is some objective truth. We will talk about that again today. And as we go through this class, reading some of your responses, there will be a temptation to make God understandable to us, to make it reasonable to us. And if we can't make it reasonable or understandable, then we can default to the fact that God does not exist, even if God does exist. And so we wrestle with this tension between our ability to understand aspects of God, and we will talk about that when we talk about the attributes of God, and what we are able to comprehend regarding who God is and what God does. And so realize that as you experience that tension. We can't eliminate that tension as much as we want to. We can't. We are finite beings, and our ability to reflect on the divine being is, somewhat limited. So realize that. Okay, so beginning our knowledge, reason, and epistemology, 2 questions that come to mind. How can we truly know something is true? So last week I began to talk about that there is some truth. Well, how do we know? How do we know something can be true? Is it all just subjective? My perception, whether I think it is true, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's my truth, and you have your truth. And so we have this tension between these truths, and so no one really knows. So how can we know something to be really true? And then finally, can we, and then how can we know? So first, can we, yes or no? And then how can we know? What are the ways that we can know something to be true? I'll go through this lecture. I did add an additional video in the email, and the additional video goes into more detail versus in regards to knowledge, belief, and kind of our assertions, or how can we know something to be true. So if you're interested more in that type of thing, feel free to watch that video. It is a little much, and so be aware of that. So our postmodern view, it is that knowledge itself is questioned. If you talk to people in the streets of Los Angeles, knowledge gets questioned. Well, how do you know? How do you know what you know? Can you really know? All of knowledge gets questioned. There's this what they would call skepticism of, what we can really believe to be true, and that gets brought into our lives. That gets brought. We see it in the media now. Well, how do you know that that is really what's going on, or they're spinning something in order to present something to us? It also happens in the church. There's doubts that we experience of God and skepticism of our own experience of life and our faith. And so all of that comes into view. And so postmodern view says, well, that's normal because we cannot really know something for sure about anything. It is all can be questioned. It is all up to the individual's perspective. And so that we should be aware of that. Most of us have experienced that both in culture and in our lives, because we live in a postmodern world, especially in the United States, as we are experiencing the effects of a postmodern world, which then gets us into trouble. One of the defaults here, if we talk about some of the philosophers that argued for this view, Nietzsche and Sartre, and both of them questioned their own reality, questioned everything about themselves. How can they really know that this is all true? Maybe I'm in a dream. Maybe this is the Matrix. If you've seen that movie, how can we really know what I'm experiencing to be true? And maybe I should just question everything. And then the conclusion with that is, if I am going to question everything, then there is no foundation for a moral life, right? Because right and wrong, good, bad, truth, lies, or untruth, being all subjective, that means I just do what I want, right? I do what I feel like doing. And the problem with that is it degrades into something not livable, and they experience that. Nietzsche experienced that, where just life would, there would be no meaning for getting up during the day or doing anything. Life becomes so meaningless if we can just do what we want to do subjectively without some kind of an ultimate truth. They would argue that morality would just be a human construction. We created it. Life is, everyone else is living according to this ethical system that was created. They would even argue that church and God was part of that people created this idea of God for us to have this construct, this measurement and diagram of how to live, both ethically, morally within life. And it's kind of to keep us in order. And so they would argue that the church did that, religion does that, our concept of God. And I know, reading some of your responses this week, that some of you believe that our idea of God created this moral, ethical system, and that's all it did. It's not reflective of the truth of God. It is merely just what we created in order to create that order in our lives. And so that's what they would believe. And again, the problem with this is that without some kind of an ultimate truth, then there is no ultimate purpose, which means our life is purposeless. There is no hope. There is no way to live our lives. If I say, well, if you believe that, then how are you living your life? What are you measuring your life according to? Are you measuring your life according to the good life? What you expect the good life to be? Do you have dreams and hopes for your lives? And if so, where did those come from? If your experience is all subjective in regards to the life around you, then there would be no origin or creation of these dreams and hopes. They would just be merely yourself responding to your cultural ethical system, and in which, why think them, why have them, why hope at all? And so it leads us down this place where there's a lot of anxiety about how to live, how to feel, how to respond to ourselves to others and this concept of God and religion. Um, and so with this ethical problem, there has to be, well, I mean, we could default there and say we're going to stop and there is no ultimate truth. Everything is subjective. We agree with the postmodern view and we just stop there. And if we do, then the other question is, well, now what? What do you want to do? And if everyone does what they want to do, then everything would be in complete chaos. So the reason for having the objective truth and is not that there would be order, but that if we believe that life is only just a group of chaotic events where we can all do what we want, the question is then why? Why do any of it at all? Why have dreams? Why think yourself? And we'll talk about some of that here today. The Christian philosopher Kierkegaard talked about the anxiety that we experience in life is because there is something truly missing in our lives. The anxiety we experience with what we want to do or the purpose of life or who am I or what should I do isn't just there because it's a cultural influence on ourselves of how we should respond to everything, but it actually has an innate purpose in our lives, and that innate purpose is to drive us to the fact that we can't figure all this out, that we are limited, that we can't figure out God on our own abilities. We can't solve the world's problems just by thinking about them, right? We can't just fix this coronavirus today and go, well, it's gone because I have the ability to make it gone. We can work towards things like that. We can work towards medication and processes, but even in that, we feel this anxiety because we feel like we could or we should be doing more and we can't, or we feel limited by that. That very anxiety is not the culture upon us, but an innate anxiety showing us that, well, then there must be something more. There must be something someone who is in charge, that is a creator, that has some things under control when I feel like life is out of control. And therefore, this something missing would be this ultimate truth, that because of the purpose in having the anxiety, then there must be something that is true then outside of myself. Otherwise, the anxiety would only point to myself and I would be able to solve it. There's a lot of things in our lives, personally, experientially, that I wish I could just solve by myself. And many of us think that we can, and there's certain levels where we can. That's why we have psychology and sociology. But at a certain point, I can't make myself live forever, right? I can't solve certain aspects of culture and life. I am limited, and I live in that tension where, I didn't make myself born, right? And so I am at the mercy of something else. And because of that, then there must be something more than just subjective reality. There must be this ultimate truth or a truth. And if it is a truth, then we would argue that there is an ultimate truth to all of existence. So if one thing is definitely true, that we can know that is true, then there must be an ultimate truth. There must be a truth that supersedes all other truth. So again, for this post, if you do agree with the postmodern view and the reflection on religion, don't worry, that's fine. But I'm arguing that is limited in its view of even ourselves, right? Because it's like in a very postmodern view where everything is subjective, why would you better yourself? Why would you become a better person? Well, and the answer is you wouldn't unless you just want to take over the world, right? If your goal is to dominate or to succeed and take everything, but at the end of the day, there is no reason to be a better person. And also, after you die, that's it, right? You leave everything else behind. which again, you can hold on to and you can believe. It's just sad. So I'm arguing that if there is one truth, then there must be an ultimate truth to life, which then influences the reason we have morality, the reason we have an ethical system, the reason we define one thing as right and another thing as wrong, good, bad, all of that. There must be a reason. Now, if all of life is subjective, then one of my arguments, and if you've been in my other classes, especially the ethics class, or when I talk about humanity or discipleship, this has come up, so this will be review for those of you who are new to my classes. This will be a little bit new for you. So as a recommendation from one of the students, I don't have the whiteboard where I draw up all the pictures and everything, so I'm going to try it on this and see if it shows up. So let's try this together. So one of my professors in seminary talked about the human, what makes us human, what makes us different than animals. And he would argue that part of being made human, or I would argue made in the image of God, but whether or not you agree with God existing yet, we haven't gotten there. But what makes us human is the ability, what we call the observed eye and observing eye. Let's see if I can't. Oh, so might be a little observed eye. Observing eye. All right. I don't like, oops, the person I have become. Hopefully this will be legible. Not sure. All right, let's see if we can see that. You see that? Kinda. We have the observed eye and the observing eye, and then in the sentence, I don't like the person I have become. There's two different eyes, right? There's the observing eye, the one observing myself. I don't like me. I don't like what I'm doing. I don't like what are my dreams? What are my hopes? So that's the observing eye. What am I observing? I'm observing myself. I don't like the person I have become. Well, the one I'm observing is the observed eye, right? So the observing eye is the I myself observing myself, and what I am observing is the observed eye. Now, this is unique. My professor in seminary argued this is unique for humanity. That no other animal self-reflects. So if we have, any kind of animal, a dog, for instance, they're not thinking, do I really like this food? Is this really my favorite food? I don't know. Well, if they're hungry, they're going to eat it. If they like it, they're going to continue eating it or not eat it, right? They're not going to self-reflect and go, 3 days ago, I really liked that food. Man, I'm just dreaming of the food in the future. So that reflection upon the self and observing themselves. They're mainly reactive. Yes, they can have emotions, they can have responses, but they're not self-reflecting on their own existence. So what's unique about humanity is we're self-reflecting on our own. We can sit and observe. We can think about our thoughts and our emotions, our experiences of yesterday, our dreams for tomorrow. And because of these two things, the argument is, well, why? Why would us as humans have these observed and observing self? This self-reflective part of ourselves. It doesn't make sense that we would have it. It's not something we just create over time through evolution, that we just begin to self-reflect, because at the end of the day, it doesn't have a lot of purpose. We're not self-reflecting on, man, I'm looking pretty good right now, right? That's not helpful for living out life, but it's not helpful for surviving. Surviving is about response to life. Thinking through problems, and that would be analytical cognition, but that's not self-reflective, right? And so there is no point, really, to having this self-reflective ability in regards to this scheme of life. And so it is actually a point of, well, it must be pointing to the fact that we aren't just all subjective. There is some ultimate truth, and it is actually a divine type of attribute of self-reflection. And so us being, in a Christian theology, us being made in the image of God, that this is part of being made in the image of God. And so we weren't made to just simply do what we want. We weren't created. The nature of humanity isn't created just to do what we want, to take over, and who cares, right? We were created with this capacity of self-reflection. And if everything is subjective and there is no truth and no absolute truth, there is no point of having this ability. Okay. And later we'll talk about how this is actually a proof for God's existence. Because I didn't create this ability to self-reflect, although I can do it, I didn't make it for myself, right? We were made with this ability. All right. Coming back to the idea of truth and truth statements, again, I asked last week, is there a true statement? And you can think of something that is true. Whether you're saying, I'm watching this video right now, or I live in Los Angeles, or whatever it is, you can say something that is true. And because there is something that is true, a true statement, not everything is subjective. Therefore, there must be a truth that is an ultimate truth. There must be a truth that is greater than all other truths. The reason for that is because then if there is one thing true, then everything can't be subjective. If everything isn't subjective, then there must be a truth before all truths, right? There must be a truth that supersedes all truth. Whether we're talking about Plato or any philosopher, this idea of this ultimate truth. Not everything is So how do we determine truth? There are statements that, although true, have different meanings, interpretations. So this becomes a problem when we think of truth. And again, the other video that I sent has a lot more that talks about truth and knowledge and how do we know something is true. And so watch that. That gets in a lot more depth and a philosophical point of view. But we have a lot of words or experiences that maybe have different meanings or interpretations. For example, love. Right? So here's a word that has many different experiences, many different interpretations on what love is. And if I say, well, have you experienced love, or do you know what love is? And you can, well, yeah, I can describe my experience of that, and someone else might have a totally different experience of that exact same word. Now, the question is, if they do have, so here's one word, here's one concept, and we could say, well, is love true? And most people would say, yeah, love is true. If you think love is a false construct, then we can have another conversation. But if we're all going to agree that love is a true thing, then how do we reconcile the fact that different people have different experiences or different definitions of this word love? And that becomes complicated, because then we want to say, well, then all of our truths of love is subjective, and there is no this ultimate definition or experience of love. However, although there can be different words to mean, different words to mean the same thing, other times we have one word that can have two different meanings. So both of those can be true. So we can have two people saying the same thing, but using two different words to say it. Or we can have one word, such as love, that has several different meanings to different people. And there could be commonalities and differences. So because of these two ways to see a truth, it questions our own reality. We want to make everything subjective. However, how many of us would say that we are content with our experience of the concept of love? How many of us want to grow in our learning or experience, want to experience more love? If that's the case, if we do want to experience more, we want to learn how to grow in love and receiving love, that means there is a spectrum, right? Whether or not we say, I want to grow in my ability of the good life, or the person I want to become. If we say, not quite the person I want to become. One, that is a reflection of our observed and observing self, but it is also meaning that there is this ideal goal, that there is this finish line, or this direction, right, that we're heading somewhere. Because that there is a spectrum in a lot of things in life, both in our concept of, say, love, but also in a lot of other things with us, that means that it must be pointing to something at the end, right? So whether or not we have one word and we have two different experiences of it, or we use two different words but we mean the same thing, both of those examples or innately have this idea of the spectrum, that there must be this end goal of whatever it is. So whether we talk about Plato and having the ideal model of life, ideal table. What is the ideal table? What is ideal love? Whatever it is, that there is this thing that we are all heading towards. And if that's the case, then there must be this ultimate truth. Although we haven't arrived yet, we cannot determine that within the process that everything is merely subjective, that there must be something we're all heading towards. And again, the same thing happens with God. If we talk of God, the same dynamics occurs. We could use language we both use God, the word God, and mean totally different things about God. We could use totally different words about God and actually be meaning the same thing about God. So the same idea exists there. But the differences and the fact that we are on this spectrum of whatever that goal is does not negate the fact that there is a goal, that there is a end direction of either what we're talking about or where we're moving or how we're growing in life and personally. Although our language might be limited in describing that. So just as our language might be limited in describing love, our experience of love, maybe we can't fully describe our experience that we want to. The same thing happens with our concept of God. We can say that since we are on this progression of understanding God, questioning God, there must be a God at the end. There must be some ultimate truth that we haven't yet arrived at, or maybe we have, and we're just trying to figure whatever that is out. But our language at times will be limited, and that's the caveat for this class as we talk and you wrestle through your own theology and answer the questions. At times your own language will be limited, and that's fine. Or maybe you have a concept and you can't quite put the words to the concept. That's fine. The part of this process is to wrestle through our own theology, wrestle through some of those words, be a little bit more concrete about what we are saying and how we are experiencing it, and so we would clarify our own theology. Although our language might be limited in describing God, that doesn't mean it's impossible to describe God or our experience of God. It just means it's limited, right? If I said, well, our understanding or description of love might be limited. Does that mean it's impossible to describe love either through a narrative, through say a testimony, through an example? Well, no. There's lots of ways to describe it, even if we feel like we are limited in doing so. And so, although our language might be limited in describing the divine being or proving that the divine being exists, it doesn't mean that it is impossible. And so part of our task is to ponder, to do that self-reflection on the very nature, existence of God, and how we experience it. So that's a little bit about truth, how we know something, our limitations in language. Again, the other video that I sent you has a lot more of knowledge and a little bit more philosophical. So one of the things I want to go over here, let me figure out how to use this app. Oh. Size. There we go. All right, back to here. Okay, so again, last week we talked about the 5 ways of what we add them up, what constitutes our theology. Well, there are 4 ways of really knowing something. Really knowing something is true. The first way is observation. So I'll write these down so you have them down. Observation. Observation, we can say observation of nature. We could say observation of history. Some of these will overlap with the what constitutes our theology. Observation of our own moral system. Why do I feel bad? Why do I feel shame of this decision? Is that just a cultural pressure? Is that something innate within myself? Well, that is an observation using the observed eye, observing eye of my own condition. So observation is how we know something to be true. Second is experience. We could say put our hands in boiling water, and our experience will teach us something that is true. That if we put our hands in boiling water, it's going to hurt. We have multiple different experiences in life, and they teach us something about life. 3 is accountability. And accountability is the support by others, holding us, testing us. This is throughout our lives, throughout history. Accountability. So whether or not, let's say I didn't observe it, maybe I haven't personally experienced it, but I can rely on the experience and observations of others regarding a certain topic. That would be part of accountability. Then I'm accepting theirs, and I don't actually have to experience it myself. Now, there's some people out there, and you might be one of them, that you need to experience it yourself, otherwise you don't believe it to be true. Hopefully you can take others' experiences into account. And then finally, assent through reason. Through reason. All right. And assent through reason is we can make deductions. We can say 1 plus 2 equals 3. And so, the first, observation of the world. Second, our experience of ourselves and of the world. Accountability, those of others. And then finally, assent through reason, that we can reason out. Now, those are the 4 main ways of how we know something to be true. Now, why is that important? Because as we continue in this class, especially next week and the weeks following, we're going to talk about proofs for God's existence. And these 4, on top of the culmination of what creates our theology, will be added together to understand how we could prove for God's existence. Observations of people, people's experiences of God, the accountability of others who have had experiences of a divine being. And then finally, we will use reason as a way that we know something. We will use logic, reasoning, to determine whether or not a divine being exists. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit about knowledge, creating the foundation of where we are going in this class so that we're all together. a couple of conclusions. One, Christian theology is a systematic process of knowledge based on personal encounter with God. As we talk about Christian theology is not just a made up group of chaotic experiences or a rational reasoning system to keep people under control so that they will create a moral society. Neither one of those. It is a systematic process, right? It uses reasoning. It's a systematic process, and that systematic process is based on personal encounter, personal experience with God, with Scripture. So we would add that in there. The Bible and others' personal experience of God, but the Bible itself, what is it really? It's people's personal experience with God, their encounters with God, both personally, socially, through history. And that leads us to the second conclusion. So the second conclusion is our knowledge of God, my knowledge of God, must be based on the fact that God must intervene and reveal himself. If my language is limited in understanding that goal, that ultimate truth, I could reason through a lot of things and probably come up short, right? I could get pretty close. Who has experienced perfect love? Not many people. Describe perfect love. Maybe I could describe it, whether or not I could experience it. I am, because I'm a limited being, at some point I am dependent on the fact that the divine being would reveal himself to me, to help me through the process, that I can't just reason my way to understanding God. Why? Because I am limited. I have experiences in life that don't point me necessarily to truth. Maybe they point me to falsehood about myself or about my reality. And so we all have some of those, right, that we work through in life, and life helps us to grow through those. But at some point I'm dependent on God revealing himself and helping me through that process. Well, in a Christian theology, we believe that the Bible is people's experience of God revealing himself personally to people through history, and then encountering that over time. Later, when we talk about proofs for God's existence, but generally, after we talk about this knowledge here, the conclusion is well, we have to be somehow dependent on God revealing himself to us, showing us who he is. That I can't just say, well, God's never revealed himself to me, so therefore God must not exist. Or my definition of God is different than someone else's. My experience of God is different than someone else's. Therefore, God must not exist, and everything must be subjective. Well, we can't default there, right? Because we are on this process, we must conclude that there must be an end goal of this process, something, right? We could conclude that we're all wrong. Everyone in the world, all religions were wrong. Yes, there is a divine being, but nobody knows who that divine being is. We've all got it wrong. We're all on process. You could conclude that. Or we can conclude that God has revealed himself through history somewhere, and someone got it right? And so we're trying to figure out, as God revealed himself, trying to figure out, well, who is this God then? Who is this divine being? How do we relate to this divine being, and what does it mean for me? So that's kind of where we're heading for the rest of the class. Next week we will talk about general revelation, and revelation is a word given for this God self-revealing to us, right? Revealing to us who he is. So we'll talk about general and specific revelation, and then the week after we'll talk about proofs for God's existence. All right.